The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics emerged from the ashes of the Russian Empire following the tumultuous events of 1917. The February Revolution toppled Tsar Nicholas II, but the provisional government that replaced him proved unable to address Russia's mounting crises. Military defeats in World War I, economic collapse, and widespread social unrest. This instability created the conditions for the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, to seize power in the October Revolution of 1917. Lenin's Bolsheviks promised peace, land, and bread to war-weary Russians. They immediately began implementing radical changes, including the nationalization of industry, redistribution of land to peasants, and Russia's withdrawal from World War I through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. However, these actions triggered a devastating civil war that lasted from 1918 to 1921, pitting the Bolshevik Red Army against various white forces, foreign interventionists, and regional separatists. The Civil War devastated the country, causing millions of deaths from combat, disease, and famine. The Bolsheviks' policy of war communism involved forced requisitioning of grain from peasants and strict state control of the economy. Despite these hardships, the Red Army ultimately prevailed, largely due to their control of key industrial centers and the organizational skills of Leon Trotsky. On December 30, 1922, the Soviet Union was formally established through the Treaty on the Creation of the USSR, uniting the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic with the Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Transcaucasian Soviet Socialist Republics. This marked the beginning of the world's first socialist state. Following the Civil War's devastation, Lenin introduced the new economic policy in 1921, which allowed limited private enterprise and market mechanisms while maintaining state control of major industries. This pragmatic approach helped stabilize the economy and restore agricultural production, though it represented a temporary retreat from pure socialist principles. Lenin's death in January 1924 triggered a power struggle within the Communist Party. Joseph Stalin, who held the seemingly minor position of General Secretary, gradually consolidated power by building a network of loyal supporters and manipulating party appointments. He outmaneuvered more prominent rivals, including Trotsky, who advocated for permanent revolution and international communist expansion. Stalin's doctrine of socialism in one country proved more appealing to a war-weary population than Trotsky's call for worldwide revolution. By 1929, Stalin had eliminated his rivals and established himself as the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. This period saw the gradual abandonment of NEP policies and the beginning of Stalin's radical transformation of Soviet society. Stalin launched an ambitious program of rapid industrialization and agricultural collectivization that fundamentally altered Soviet society. The first five-year plan aimed to transform the USSR from an agricultural nation into an industrial powerhouse. Massive projects like the construction of new cities, steel mills, and hydroelectric dams mobilized millions of workers and resources. Collectivization proved far more traumatic than industrialization. Stalin forcibly consolidated millions of small peasant farms into large collective farms and state farms. Wealthy peasants, known as kulaks, were liquidated as a class through execution, imprisonment, or deportation. Peasant resistance was met with brutal repression, contributing to a man-made famine in Ukraine and other regions during 1932 to 1933 that killed millions. The period also witnessed the Great Terror, a campaign of political repression that eliminated perceived enemies of the state. Show trials convicted prominent party leaders, military officers, and intellectuals of treason and sabotage. Millions of ordinary citizens were arrested, executed, or sent to labor camps in the Gulag system. The terror decimated the Communist Party leadership and the military officer corps, leaving Stalin with absolute power but a severely weakened state apparatus. Despite these human costs, the Soviet Union achieved remarkable industrial growth. By 1940, it had become the world's second-largest industrial power, with significant advances in steel production, heavy machinery, and military equipment. This industrial base would prove crucial in the coming war with Nazi Germany. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, marked the beginning of what Russians call the Great Patriotic War. The attack caught the Red Army unprepared, partly due to Stalin's purges of military leadership and his miscalculation of Hitler's intentions. German forces advanced rapidly, capturing vast territories and millions of prisoners. The siege of Leningrad, the battle for Moscow, and the encirclement of Soviet forces in Ukraine created a desperate situation. However, the Soviet Union's industrial capacity, harsh winter conditions, and the determination of its people gradually turned the tide. The Battle of Stalingrad marked a crucial turning point where the Red Army encircled and destroyed an entire German army. Soviet industry, much of it relocated beyond the Urals, began outproducing German war materials. The Red Army, supported by Lend-Lease aid from the United States and Britain, launched a series of offensives that pushed German forces back. The war's final phase saw Soviet forces advancing through Eastern Europe and into Germany itself, culminating in the capture of Berlin in May 1945. The war's cost was enormous. The Soviet Union lost approximately 27 million people, including both military personnel and civilians. Entire cities were destroyed, and the western regions of the country lay in ruins. However, victory established the USSR as a global superpower and extended Soviet influence across Eastern Europe. The immediate post-war period focused on reconstruction and consolidating Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Stalin imposed communist governments in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, and East Germany, creating a buffer zone against future Western threats. This expansion of Soviet influence alarmed Western powers and contributed to the beginning of the Cold War. The Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons in 1949, ending American nuclear monopoly and escalating tensions. The Berlin blockade and the formation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact institutionalized the division of Europe. The Korean War further demonstrated the global nature of East-West competition. Domestically, the Fourth Five-Year Plan successfully rebuilt much of the war-torn economy. However, Stalin's paranoia intensified in his final years, leading to new purges and the persecution of Jewish intellectuals and officials. The planned deportation of Soviet Jews was prevented only by Stalin's death in March 1953. Stalin's death triggered another succession struggle, eventually won by Nikita Khrushchev, who became first secretary in 1953. Khrushchev's leadership marked a dramatic departure from Stalinist policies. His secret speech to the 20th Party Congress in 1956 denounced Stalin's crimes and initiated a process of de-Stalinization. The Khrushchev era brought significant liberalization. Political prisoners were released from the Gulag, censorship was relaxed, and cultural life experienced a thaw. Economic reforms aimed to improve consumer goods production and agricultural output. The Virgin Lands campaign attempted to increase grain production by cultivating previously unused land in Central Asia and Siberia. In foreign policy, Khrushchev pursued peaceful coexistence with the West while maintaining Soviet influence in the developing world. However, his period also saw major Cold War crises, including the Hungarian Revolution, the U-2 incident, the Berlin crisis, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. The latter brought the world to the brink of nuclear war before both superpowers stepped back from confrontation. Khrushchev's erratic leadership style and policy failures, including the Cuban Missile Crisis and agricultural shortfalls, led to his removal by the Politburo in 1964. However, his reforms had permanently changed Soviet society and created expectations for continued liberalization. Leonid Brezhnev's rise to power in 1964 marked the beginning of an era characterized by political stability but economic stagnation. Brezhnev reversed many of Khrushchev's reforms and established a more conservative, bureaucratic approach to governance. The period saw the end of major political purges and the emergence of a stable, if aging, political elite. The Brezhnev Doctrine, announced after the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia, asserted the Soviet Union's right to intervene in socialist countries to preserve communist rule. This policy was applied in Afghanistan in 1979, beginning a costly 9-year war that would severely strain Soviet resources and morale. Economically, the 1960s and early 1970s saw continued growth, but the pace gradually slowed. The Soviet Union achieved nuclear parity with the United States and became a global military superpower. However, the centrally planned economy proved increasingly unable to innovate or respond to consumer needs. By the 1970s, economic growth had slowed dramatically and shortages of consumer goods became endemic. The period also witnessed the emergence of a dissident movement, led by figures like Andrei Sakharov and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who challenged the Soviet system through underground literature and human rights activism. The government's response combined limited tolerance with selective repression, including the use of psychiatric hospitals to silence critics. Brezhnev's death in 1982 began a period of rapid leadership changes. Yuri Andropov attempted to revitalize the economy through anti-corruption campaigns and discipline measures, but his efforts were cut short by illness and death. Konstantin Chernenko represented a return to Brezhnev-era policies but died after just 13 months in office. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union faced mounting crises. Economic growth had stagnated, technological innovation lagged behind the West, and the war in Afghanistan continued to drain resources. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986 revealed the system's inability to handle complex technological challenges and damaged the government's credibility. The appointment of Mikhail Gorbachev as General Secretary in March 1985 marked the beginning of the most significant reform period since the 1920s. Gorbachev recognized that the Soviet system required fundamental changes to survive in the modern world. Gorbachev introduced two key reform policies, Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost allowed unprecedented freedom of speech and press, leading to open discussion of Soviet history and contemporary problems. Perestroika aimed to restructure the economy by introducing market mechanisms while maintaining socialist principles. These reforms unleashed forces that Gorbachev could not control. Greater openness revealed the extent of Soviet problems and encouraged demands for more radical changes. Economic restructuring disrupted existing production systems without creating effective alternatives, leading to shortages and social unrest. In foreign policy, Gorbachev pursued détente with the West and ended Soviet involvement in Afghanistan. He allowed Eastern European countries to choose their own governments, leading to the peaceful collapse of communist rule in 1989. The fall of the Berlin Wall symbolized the end of the Cold War division of Europe. Growing nationalism in the Soviet republics posed an existential threat to the USSR. The Baltic states led the movement for independence, followed by other republics. Gorbachev's attempts to preserve the Union through a new federal treaty were opposed by both hardliners and independence movements. The failed coup attempt by hardliners in August 1991 fatally weakened Gorbachev's position and accelerated the USSR's collapse. Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Republic, emerged as a key figure in defeating the coup and supporting democratic reforms. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president and the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. The Soviet Union's 69-year existence profoundly shaped the 20th century. It demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of attempting to build a socialist society through centralized planning and one-party rule. The USSR achieved remarkable feats, including rapid industrialization, victory in World War II, and the creation of a global superpower that rivaled the United States. However, the Soviet experiment also revealed the dangers of authoritarian rule, economic inflexibility, and the suppression of individual rights. The human cost of Soviet policies, including famines, purges, and restrictions on freedom, cannot be ignored when assessing the system's legacy. The USSR's collapse marked the end of the Cold War and the beginning of a new era in international relations. The 15 independent states that emerged from the Soviet Union continue to grapple with the legacy of their shared past while building new political and economic systems. The Soviet experience remains a crucial case study in the possibilities and limitations of revolutionary social transformation in the modern world.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more engaging historical content.